Welcome, Hazel. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today, and you look fabulous. Would you mind just explaining a bit about yourself, a bit of a biography, if you wouldn't mind?
Absolutely, yes. So my name is Hazel, and I'm originally from India. I grew up in India, and then I went to Rome, Italy, for my college, for my undergraduate education. I did that in international relations. I was really interested in sort of governance and politics and that side of IR. And when I was doing my undergraduate studies in international relations, I realized I'm also really interested in the legal side of things and how law shapes policy and how law shapes human interests and response to human interests. So I decided to do my LLM, my master's in law, specifically in human rights law and international human rights law. And I did it in Brussels, Belgium, but through a British university in Belgium. So sort of got a bit of both systems, which is really lovely. And it was nice to be so close to the EU and see how they do their law and policy making while I did my master's. And then after working there for a bit, I also did my PhD there. While I was doing my master's, I got very into women's rights and looking at law, international policy, social elements of women's rights. So then I did my PhD there. And now I work as an independent consultant in human rights with Held Diplomats and also with a volunteering organization called Serve the City.
Wonderful. And it's interesting because you mentioned that, obviously you moved to Brussels, which is a huge change for yourself coming from India, and you were learning about, how they create policies. And what
Mhm.
struck you? Were you struck by any big differences between, what you'd seen back in India versus Brussels or Europe? Could you talk a bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. I think really in doing legal studies and getting so into it, it's very interesting to see the similarities and differences between different legal systems. When you look at it on paper, you can divide them into, different categories, but in reality, it just works out to be much more complex than that. For example, one of the interesting differences I found is India, a lot of its legal system, because it was a colony and it was colonized, is almost directly imported from the British legal system of 100 years ago or so. But we do have a lot of similar policies, whereas the UK since then has changed a lot of theirs. So that's something I found really interesting, especially when it connects to human rights and women's rights, is that a lot of policies may not be reactive to where India itself is as a country, but rather was adopted or imported from a different situation and a different culture and a different sort of category as such. It's really interesting.
Yeah. So, in terms of the specific projects that you've either worked on in the past or working on now or just more recently, are there any specific projects that really stand out for you as being either the most interesting or maybe the most important to explore long term? Anything that really stands out?
Yeah, I think not really intentionally, but maybe a little bit sort of a through line throughout the main projects that I've done in my life have been this element of social legal research. So not looking at the law itself, but looking at how law interacts with society and how society interacts with law. And most of my research has been in relation to women's rights when it comes to social legal research. And I think a bigger part of it obviously is my PhD, and that really came from the question of, okay, so laws exist in India. There are a lot of laws for women's rights. There are a lot of laws in general, but the reality of life in India for a lot of women does not always reflect what the legal situation looks like. Why is that? Why do we have these laws and still there's such violence and such acceptable violence, socially acceptable violence against women? So I think that's something that drives a lot of my research and the angle through which I approach the things that I'm interested in.
You mentioned that there's a lot of socially acceptable violence against women in India. What are those areas? What is seen as socially acceptable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think India is in a stage where it's changing. What socially acceptable is changing, but at the same time, there's limits to how much it changes, or there's things that we don't say are socially acceptable, but we know are. For example, one of those areas is violence within a marriage. So what I looked at specifically in my PhD and research outside that is why violence in private situations, so within the home, is seen as more acceptable than violence by strangers, which is I found to be really odd and counterintuitive. And I found that a lot of myths and perceptions that surround Indian culture, things like it's a woman's job to have her husband be happy, men have rights over their wives. India still doesn't have a marital rape exception. Rape within a marriage is still legal in India. So things like that really permeate social and legal culture in India, in order to make certain forms of violence. So, like slapping the wife, and if she deserves it for different reasons, really prevalent, and in newspapers and articles even to this day, where there's stories that are just normalized, and a big part of life that you grow up with.
Yeah. I mean, compared to when you were a child versus now, have you seen women's rights improve in any ways, regarding marital law and what's acceptable? Have things changed, or do you think that it's stagnated?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that things are changing, but there is a huge counter movement that's also happening at the same time. I think sometimes it's seen as a men's rights women movement. Sometimes it's seen as being against a narrative. So a lot of laws that do exist, there is a narrative that women are falsely accusing men and they're misusing these laws. It's called a misuse argument, and that's getting even stronger just as women's rights are getting stronger. So there is a lot of opposition to women's rights seen in elements like this. And with the misuse argument, for example, it's very interesting because there is no data to show that there is misuse of these laws. The statistics that are often used to prove misuse, so to speak, is just the statistics of the number of cases that were inconclusive, or cases that were dropped. And there's many reasons that can happen: insufficient evidence, or one of the parties is pressured to remove their claim, or many other things. So the data that's being used for this very prominent, very prevalent misuse argument isn't really reliable the way that people take it to be. So it's on
Yeah.
both sides.
And you mentioned to me before that you have done or are doing work with a charity that help
Mhm.
women in violent situations. Would you mind expanding on the specific things that you've done personally to help?
Yes, I think one of the most important things that we need to do, especially when you're coming from a different perspective or an international perspective when looking at violence against women in any context, is make sure that you're addressing the grassroots of what's happening in any particular city, country, town, because or else you're just bringing different ideologies that might not apply to a certain context. So I do think it's really important. And one thing where I live now, I've made sure to do, and I think it's really important for people to do, is to interact with women's shelters here, is to interact with, state care shelters and facilities, and see what the needs on ground are. A lot of times criminalization is something that's really lauded, and the law places a lot of emphasis on criminalizing activities. And as important as that is, what we found in reality on ground is criminalization isn't really practical for a lot of women who have their financial sustenance through their husband and their social standing through their husband. So other options like civil suits or stay orders, protection orders, those are as, if not more important in certain contexts. And it's only by interacting with these women and seeing their needs on ground, why they won't go to the law, what happens when they do go to the law, that you realize these dynamics.
And would you mind speaking a bit about the other charity work you do with Serve the City?
Yes, absolutely. So Serve the City is an NGO that I was involved with as a volunteer, and now I'm very happy and privileged to work for. And Serve the City basically opens up avenues for anyone and everyone to volunteer. So our goal is everybody volunteers, and we say that many people doing small things together can make a big difference. So there's needs in every city, and they look different from city to city, but everyone has something that they can give to serve others in the city. So we started off being based in Brussels. We're now in many cities around the world, and lots of our projects in Europe and mainly Brussels also do revolve around refugees in response to the refugee crisis that has happened and continues to happen. But we also deal with many other topics like human trafficking, old age homes, youth, loneliness, mental health, environment. So a lot of different areas volunteer and give their time before work, after work, during work, weekends, to a cause that they feel close to.
Yeah. So if somebody wanted to volunteer with Serve the City and learn more, there's a website, yeah? Could they just go to the website, or how could they get more involved?
Yes, absolutely. So there is a Serve the City International website, and that can help redirect you. But you can also check if there's a Serve the City in your city. So if you just Google Serve the City and then your city's name, we have, like I mentioned, many cities around the world. We're actually expanding a lot in Africa and Asia this year, which is really exciting. And there will always be a contact email or contact number for you to get in touch for different volunteering projects and volunteering opportunities around the world. And if it's not in your city yet, please feel free to get in touch anyway with Serve the City International, and we can see what we can do next.
Sure. And more recently, you've been doing some work in tobacco harm reduction and, researching, writing about some of the key issues or clarifying some information and educating people. Could you just maybe give your thoughts on what you've learned since being exposed to the tobacco harm reduction space?
Absolutely. And it's been a really lovely journey to learn more about tobacco harm reduction. It's something, and I think that's lovely about research, is that you can come in with just a topic and then it opens up a whole universe. And every time you're like, oh, that's really interesting as well. Okay, I want to know more about that too. So it's been very much like that for me with tobacco harm reduction. And I think one of the driving forces of my research in general has been the topic of awareness, just making sure that women, humans, individuals, whatever the context, know about the different options that they have, and that those options are accessible, that they have assistance to get to those options. And that resonates so thoroughly and clearly with tobacco harm reduction as well, that it's not the zero-sum game. It's not that you stay in a situation or you leave the situation entirely in a way that society dictates or in a way that you might have thought you have to, but there's so many other alternatives and so many other options in order to help you get out of a situation that you might not want to be in. And with tobacco harm reduction, it's very interesting to see how things change week by week. There's always new information, new research, new products coming up that can help people who want to quit smoking, who want to have a better standard of living, a longer quality of life. There are so many options for them to be able to do so. And again, with a passion for countries of the global south, or countries that might not be considered Western countries, it's lovely to see and to be able to be part of sharing the research and sharing information about the expansion of such opportunities as well.
Yeah, and can you mention any specific articles or projects that you've worked on recently in tobacco harm reduction?
Yes, absolutely. Very recently, we helped release a report called the Life Save Report. So this is based off a model that was implemented in Sweden in order to help create and build a smoke-free Sweden. And the same sort of model was applied and used in 4 lower and middle income countries. We have Bangladesh, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, and South Africa. And it was lovely and so interesting, so inspiring, and really just let's do it. It just made me feel like let's take that next step in order to see how the quality of life can be improved in these countries, how smoking can be reduced, how the risk of such huge diseases, and normally the diseases that are in the top 10 killing diseases of these countries are tobacco related. So it's really interesting to see how those can, the quality of life and fatalities can be reduced in these countries, quality of life can be improved in these countries. So that's a report that was very interesting that we've worked on recently and helped also disseminate to the general public through different platforms.
Sure, thank you for mentioning those. And just a very last question. Do you see any kind of crossover between
Mhm.
issues with human rights in India versus some of the issues in tobacco harm reduction?
Mm. Yes, absolutely. I do think that, again, coming back to social change, I think social change is a big element that needs to happen for both sides, for people to be able to look at different alternatives when they're faced with situations that they want to change. So I do think that social change is something that we can help spread awareness about for people to realize there's other options, whether it comes to women's rights or whether it comes to tobacco harm reduction. And at the end of the day, in both cases, it's not about all or nothing, and it's not about forcing you to go down a different path. It's just about showing you all the different paths that exist. And that's something we all want to know about. We all want to have knowledge. I think knowledge is power. So I do think that there's so many similarities between the two, and it feels really good to be able to help and contribute to both, and hopefully help create some of that social change in the future.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Hazel. It's been such a pleasure to have you with us, and I would love to do another one with you again in the future if you'd be happy to.